Good evening, listener. This is your weekly history podcast, History Isle Podcast. Tonight, we have a very interesting episode centered around the First Industrial Revolution. But before we get into that, I would like to thank all the people who've made this series possible, our production team and our sponsor, but also to our listener. So please sit back and enjoy episode number 1 of History Isle Podcast, The Industrial Revolution. Our story begins on a collection of islands off the coast of Europe, the British Isle. Now, for thousands of years, the isle had not changed much, just like the rest. The majority of people worked in the farming industry. A few worked in cities, making clothing items, or working in workshops, making other menial goods. However, starting around the 17th century, something began to happen. A revolution was coming that would fundamentally change the very way these people and all people lived their lives. Over the course of one generation, people went from working in the rural countryside to living in highly urbanized cities like London, Manchester, and Birmingham. People went from growing their own food to buying food many times removed from its original grower. This revolution was none other than the Industrial Revolution, and the world hasn't been the same since. Now, before we get into the nitty-gritty of the what and the how, we must first establish the all-important when. There's actually a surprising amount of debate surrounding the start. An English historian and philosopher by the name of Arnold Toynbee was the first to popularize the term Industrial Revolution, a revolution that he said ranged from 1760 to 1840. So that is the range I will be sticking to. To clarify, we are only talking about the first Industrial Revolution right now. The second Industrial Revolution is a whole different topic in its own right. However, some of the most influential innovations of the revolution had already been invented. This period was when it all came together. Now, one of the biggest questions that I had going into the Industrial Revolution was, why Britain? What caused a group of swampy and damp islands to become the undisputed masters of the world? Why not a place like the United States, Germany, or even France, for that matter? I am aware that at the start of the revolution, places like the United States and Germany did not exist. The United States was founded officially in 1776, and it would take Germany another 100 years until 1870 to become a fully unified country in its own right. But still, why didn't the people in these regions create inventions that would spark the biggest changes in human existence since the Agrarian Revolution? There is a theory that the British were just naturally industrious and entrepreneurial people. But then why didn't the US, which at the same time was very culturally similar to Britain, not spearhead the revolution? The answer is, quite frankly, they felt no need to. Let me explain. The fundamental thing that the revolution did was allow people to create more stuff, mine more resources, or build more things with the same or less people. Efficiency was the name of the game. And when you have higher efficiency, you can create more things. And when you can create more things, you can sell more things. And when you can sell more things, you can make or save more money. Around the 17th century, labor costs in Britain were higher than in any other part of the world. This is due to a number of factors, such as the urbanization of the country. However, the biggest contributors were perhaps the country's booming trade with the outside world. The country was making things not only for themselves, but also for the outside world, and labor wasn't too short of a supply for the demand. Adam Smith discussed this type of scenario in his 1776 book, The Wealth of Nations, with a little law called supply and demand. In a nutshell, it states that if the supply of, well, quite frankly, anything was higher than the demand, prices would fall. But if the supply was too small, but if the supply was too small, the labor prices in Britain for the demand, the need for labor prices would rise. There's one phenomenon that has been responsible for most of humankind's great inventions and changes. People like making and they like amassing as much wealth as they can. When labor prices rise, people now have a motivation and demand for labor-saving methods. This explanation can explain why a country like France or Germany, with a much larger labor pool, did not industrialize first. And while this can explain what caused the demand, there are other reasons why the UK managed to create this demand as effectively as it did. The first reason was the government's protection of the process. They prevented any form of the revolution from leaving the island. The government forbade the export of skilled workers, including the techniques and machines they use. It was not until 1807 that William and John Cockernel brought the revolution to Belgium on the European mainland. The Belgian Revolution was a lot like the one in the UK, centered on textiles, coal, and iron. This isolation gave the UK's industries time to grow. They also restricted the export of goods, lowering competition in the UK market and allowing local production to really take hold. The second reason is entirely based on good luck and the geographic surroundings. The British Isles have vast quantities of easily accessible ore, like iron and tin, and especially coal, which serves as great sources of cheap energy. The mining industry in Britain was already well established, which gave it a huge advantage over other countries. Instead of creating a mining industry from scratch, Britain could simply ramp up production. Another factor that made the coal and ore extraction business even more convenient was the fact that most of the cities that sprung up around the coal and iron fields were also located by navigable rivers. Coal towns such as Northumberland and Lancashire had the rivers Tyne and the River Ribble respectively. These rivers served as the modern-day equivalent of highway systems before the rail system came into its own. The coal and iron could be loaded onto steamships and sent all around the Isles in large quantities to cities like Manchester and Liverpool that served as manufacturing hubs. The coal was then used to power machines that allowed mining even more efficiently, creating a positive feedback loop of coal mining feeding innovation, innovation feeding coal mining. The atmospheric steam engine was invented by Thomas Newcomb in the early 1700s. James Watt improved the invention significantly in the 1760s. Watt's improvements allowed the engine to be used in all manner of the production, from paper and flour to the mining industry that fed the machine itself. The use of engines, like with much of the rest of the revolution, had greatly improved the efficiency of these industries, allowing the amount of goods to skyrocket and allowing even the poor of the UK to be much better off. Now, before we finish this episode, we must discuss something that is as synonymous with the Industrial Revolution as computers were with the Internet Revolution in the late 20th century. The working conditions and the often horrid conditions of cities like Manchester and Birmingham. Because of all the factories in their cities pumping out large amounts of smoke and debris, the air pollution in these cities was oftentimes utterly awful. Choking clouds of smoke caused awful respiratory conditions among the workers. That was not even the worst of it. Working conditions within the factories were also awful. Because the industry was so young and because it would cost more, there were almost no worker protections of any kind. Young children could work in conditions that would get an employer in massive trouble these days, and they would work for 12 hours a day, which was not uncommon. The wages these people made, even adjusted for inflation, were still quite low for their standard of living. While people working in the rural sector in the countryside made less money, they also had much lower expenses compared to the urban living that the industrial worker would have to pay for. It wasn't until the early 20th century that a combination of technological advancements brought people out of the strenuous jobs and into the service sectors. Governments required workers' protections, and awful conditions were no longer the norm. Interestingly, and this is something I don't think most people realize, is the role the stock market played in spreading the wealth. During the early stages of the Industrial Revolution, there really wasn't that much difference in wealth ownership between factories and farms. Most of the early factory owners were already wealthy landowners, and with their newfound factories containing the newest toys, the owners would instill a very top-down model in which they owned the entire means of production, just moving the hierarchy and aristocracy from one form, farming, to another, factories. One of the problems that caused this was the sheer fact that the machines needed to be competitive were really, really expensive. So only people who already had money could participate. It wasn't until these machines fell in price that ordinary people could start up their own factories and become some of the biggest industrialists the world had ever seen. People like Andrew Carnegie or John D. Rockefeller come to mind. The other thing that helped was the invention and introduction of the stock market. While it didn't make the bottom of the economic ladder much richer, it did help spread out the wealth and help people who might have already been somewhat well off even better, allowing them to buy their machines to start their own factories. And I want you to ask yourself this question. When did the stock market begin? The 1850s? The 1900s? Well, this fact surprised me. The London Stock Exchange was founded in 1770, and the New York Exchange, 1790. And these weren't even the oldest. The Amsterdam Stock Exchange was founded in 1602, almost 2 centuries before. Now, I am afraid that this is where our story today will have to end. If you would like to hear more about this subject, or even just history in general, make sure to subscribe to History a la Podcast and tell us what you would like to hear next. But before you go, I'd like to thank you, our listener, our amazing production team, and our sponsors. So I must bid you farewell. Good morning, good evening, and good night, and I'll see you next time on History a la Podcast.